What is going on in the Israel-Hamas War? How many hostages remain in captivity? How many have been freed? How many of them are still alive? How many people have been killed in the Gaza Strip? How many of them are civilians? How many are militants? What is the situation with humanitarian aid? How does the West Bank fit into all this? What is happening between Israel and Hezbollah? Regional developments, the war between Israel, Iran, and the Houthis, and the political developments surrounding this conflict. I'm Alon Burstein. I'm a visiting assistant professor and an Israel Institute fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. What follows is a talk that I gave on May 6, 2024 at UCI, summarizing 7 months to the war and covering all these various different topics. All the numbers and data that I give in this talk are updated as of May 6th. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I hope you find this informative, and thanks for watching.
Thank you everyone for coming. I'm sorry that the subject is a depressing subject. The subjects that I usually lecture about are depressing. I lecture about terrorism, I lecture about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. No one feels good at the end of my talk, so I'm starting from apologizing about that. I knew this wouldn't work when the time comes. I've tested this before, okay. It is not working. Sorry. We are stuck for the moment. Nope. There we go. Okay. Just need a little bit of encouragement. What I'm going to cover in this talk is way too much. Because really, when I thought of how do I give a talk about 7 months to the war, the main issue that I'm going to try to convey is the complexity of this war. Every war is complex. This war involves numerous arenas, numerous settings, and one of the things, I don't need to convince anyone, I think, that there's a lot of emotion surrounding this war. And one of the things that tend to happen is most people that are very, very attached to a certain facet, whether it's the hostages that we're going to talk about, whether it's the situation in the Gaza Strip that we're going to talk about, whether it's the occupation in the West Bank that we're going to talk about, often see, why can't that be resolved? Why can't you focus on that? All of these arenas are tied together. All these arenas influence each other. All these arenas are part of what make this so complicated. So what I'm going to do is take us through these different arenas, what happened on October 7th and the hostage situation, the fighting going on in the Gaza Strip, the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the situation in northern Israel, southern Lebanon, regional and political. For each of these, because it's way too much, for each of these, I am mostly going to give a couple of highlights of what happened in the last 7 months. And then, after that, I'm going to mostly give some data, some information, because again, there's been so much. So I'll give some information about it. And yes, as Jeff said, a lot of the topics are controversial. I'm happy to field questions on why are things presented this way, but I heard those numbers there. All of these numbers are things that I've researched for a long time. One of the things I'll say, just because I see some people taking pictures, feel free, but I also will say that I'm going to upload the talk. It's being recorded. I'm going to upload it onto my YouTube channel on the war. I upload summaries about it all the time. So feel free, but also it's going to be uploaded, presuming that it all works. So I'm starting very briefly. I'm not going to give the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm trying to just set the stage for a minute. October 6th, what was going on? What was the situation when the war breaks out? Again, there's the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I see a bunch of my students from my history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict class. You know how complicated this conflict is. What I'm mostly going to focus on is where things were when they got started. And really what we're talking about is this map over here. Sorry, I was going to show it over there. This map over here. Really, this is the region that we're talking about. This is Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. This is the West Bank. This is the Gaza Strip. One of the things, it's hard to see the Gaza Strip because it's so small. We're going to talk about the density in the Gaza Strip as well. The situation, again, as of October 6th, in the West Bank, very complicated. The entire region is under overarching Israeli occupation. However, within the West Bank, there's 3 different zones of control. 60% of the West Bank is directly controlled by the Israeli military. 40% of the West Bank is mixed between Palestinian Authority and Israeli military. I'm going to talk about that a little later. The situation in the Gaza Strip, again, when the war breaks out, The situation in the, why is this mouse not working? The situation in the Gaza Strip down here. The Gaza Strip, a very, very small area. The entire area of the Gaza Strip, 141 square miles. To give some context, the area of Los Angeles is over 500 square miles. Just to give some context of the density and small area that we're talking about. Within it, roughly 2.2 to 2.4 million Palestinians. The area since 2007 is effectively controlled by Hamas. I say effectively because the legitimacy of that control depends who you ask. De facto, Hamas controls it. De facto, there is a blockade from the air and sea by Israel, as well as a land blockade by Egypt, which has a land border on Rafah over here, and Israel. That's the situation starting on October 7th. And again, we can talk about later in questions, but what happened before, how did that happen? How did we get there? What happens on October 7th when things break out? On the morning of October 7th, Hamas launches an unprecedented terror attack against Israel. Unprecedented is the largest attack in history of terrorism on all parameters except for the amount of casualties, beaten only by 9/11. In terms of the amount of attackers, the amount of people taken hostage, the amount of people, et cetera, et cetera. What happens? 2,000 to 3,000 Hamas operatives and also operatives of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other organizations burst through between 15 to 80 holes that they blow up in the fence that surrounds the Gaza Strip. They also carry out the invasion from the sea units, as well as from the air hang gliders. They launch roughly 3,000 to 4,000 rockets, mortars, and missiles within the first 10 hours. These fighters take over the Israeli towns and kibbutzim that are surrounding the Gaza Strip, as well as attacking a big outdoor party that was going on in the area of the desert there as well. The attack lasted roughly 12 hours, the actual attack, then afterwards it took a lot longer. The attack lasted roughly 12 hours. By day's end, it is a complete massacre. By day's end, there's a lot of sexual violence that was reported. Over 1,195 Israelis are killed in this attack, of which 366 are IDF soldiers and security officials, and the rest are civilians. Roughly 3,300 people are injured, of which roughly 1,000 are IDF soldiers and the rest are civilians. And 252 people are kidnapped back to the Gaza Strip. This includes entire families, babies, elderly, women, children, etc. I put the numbers here, 252. People have heard different numbers. There were also 4 Israelis that were already held in the Gaza Strip. That's why people have sometimes heard different numbers, 257, 56. These are the most accurate numbers as of now. Again, that's the context of what happened then. In terms of the hostage situation, where things stand right now, and I emphasize right now because as I speak, there's talk about a new hostage deal and things may be developing. So literally news flashes may come into the phone that may change things. But as of now, of the 252 that were kidnapped, 112 have been returned alive. That includes 4 hostages that Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad released 2 weeks after the war as humanitarian gestures. Another 105 hostages that were returned during a truce and a hostage exchange between the sides. Another 3 hostages that were rescued by the IDF. In addition to that, the bodies of 12 hostages have been retrieved. That includes 3 hostages that managed to escape and were killed inadvertently by the IDF, as well as other bodies that the IDF managed to retrieve of hostages that were killed while in captivity. Totally remaining in captivity right now are 132 hostages, of which the IDF says that 35 are confirmed dead, and different reports over the last months have suggested that both Israeli intelligence and US intelligence believes that at least 20 to 30 more are also dead. But that is not confirmed. What the IDF at least has confirmed is that 35 are dead. Hamas has put out information saying that, recognizing that 12 are dead, but not giving the actual numbers of the rest of them. Again, like I said, I'm just giving segments of where things started. That is the October 7th attack and the aftermath of that attack and the hostage situation. Keep on going the wrong way. Now I'm turning to what happened since then in the Gaza Strip. And like I said, I'm touching on a lot of different things, so write down questions. Think of questions for later, because I'm skipping through a lot. On October 8th, Israel's retaliation against Hamas in the Gaza Strip began. It began with imposing an absolute siege. Until now, I said there was a siege, but nonetheless, there was also different things that were permitted until then. An absolute siege is imposed right away. That means cutting off water lines. That means stopping the entrance of humanitarian aid trucks. I'm going to talk about that in the next section on humanitarian aid. And as of October 11th, cutting off all electrical lines that go into the Gaza Strip. That's an absolute siege. In addition to that, an unprecedented bombing campaign begins. Again, like the October 7th attack was unprecedented in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The bombing campaign that begins at that moment, also unprecedented in the history of this conflict. Again, just to give some context, within the first week of bombings, over 6,000 air raids were carried out, dropping over 4,000 tons of bombs in the Gaza Strip. That is equivalent to what the United States dropped in Afghanistan in 1 year. Again, just to show us what has happened, what has developed. Rockets continued to be fired, and the situation continued in the first months of the war. Skipping on down now to the ground invasion that began. On October 13th, the IDF ordered all Palestinian civilians in what is considered, sorry, I always go the wrong way, what is considered the northern part. Oh, is my camera in the way there? Well, yeah, like I said, I wanted to say something about that. What is considered the northern part of the Gaza Strip, above this line that I'm going to talk about soon. This is Gaza City over here. The IDF ordered a complete evacuation of Palestinian civilians from that area, preparing for its invasion. Over the course of 2 weeks, more than 1 million Palestinian civilians become internally displaced and move down south in what are designated humanitarian corridors towards the areas of El Mawasi and Rafah, which I'm going to talk about later because they're very up and coming in the news right now, over here. On October 26th, the IDF launches its ground invasion with the explicit mission of rescuing the hostages and destroying Hamas. The ground invasion is launched into the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. Very, very intensive fighting happens in the first few months. The IDF is fighting primarily, again, in this region, in the northern parts of the Strip at this time. And within a few months, the IDF declares what it calls operational control in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip on December 22nd. Since then, there's still ongoing fighting in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, but the IDF has pulled out all of its fighting units from this area. What is happening right now is more localized raids in the different areas of the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. And there's somewhat of a power vacuum there right now, which again, I don't have time to get into, but I'll be very happy if someone wants to ask about that in the question time, because there's a lot to say about the power vacuums that are happening in the Gaza Strip. In addition to that, on December 3rd, the IDF launched an invasion into the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, into Khan Yunis, that is the area over here. Khan Yunis is a very, very big stronghold of Hamas. It had over 4 battalions of Hamas units. The fighting there was extremely intensive, among others because there were less aerial bombings that were carried out. The fighting there took about 4 months. And on April 7th, the IDF declared that it has achieved operational control of Khan Yunis and also pulled its forces out. Until this morning, there were no fighting forces within the Gaza Strip except for localized raids and what I'm going to talk about in a minute, this corridor over here. All that changed as of this morning. The IDF has launched an invasion, or began the invasion of the southeastern parts of Rafah. I did not update the PowerPoint about that because it's been updating all the time. But that is happening right now. So when I say there's no other active fighting going on, not true as of a few hours ago. In addition to the ongoing fighting, the IDF has begun establishing 2 permanent positions, but permanent again, within the negotiations happening right now, maybe not, within the Gaza Strip. One, in January, it was reported that the IDF is building what it calls the Netzarim corridor. Netzarim was the name of an old Israeli settlement that was here, essentially dividing the Gaza Strip from north to south. That is the first time that the IDF, since it evacuated Gaza in 2005, has established permanent positions. Outposts are being set up and checkpoints are being set up, dividing the Gaza Strip from the north to the south. That is a big issue when it comes to the negotiations between the sides. In addition to that, starting in December, there were reports that the IDF has been constructing a buffer zone, that is this red area that goes along the border, carrying out operations, essentially removing all buildings and anything that's in this area to create a buffer zone that the IDF is going to control, protecting Israel from Gaza. This is Israel on this side. Those are two things that are ongoing, and again, I mention them because they're a very important part of the ongoing negotiations right now. Some data, again, like I said, those are just highlights from the 7 months, some data and information about the fighting in the Gaza Strip. From the Gaza Strip, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have launched over 9,000 rockets and missiles towards Israel. Those rockets are still being launched, they are still ongoing. Regarding the IDF attacks, in January there were estimates that the IDF back then, we're talking 3 months ago, had launched over 45,000 of bombs and missiles into the Gaza Strip, amounting to 65,000 tons of bombs. A few weeks ago, the IDF put out its own summary saying that it had carried out 32,000 airstrikes into the Gaza Strip. I remind you how small and dense the Gaza Strip is. Regarding some information about the outcome of these strikes, the destruction, first of all, according to a UN report, in this area of the buffer zone around the border, which constitutes 1% of the territory of the Gaza Strip, the UN estimates that 90% of the structures, 4,000 structures, are completely destroyed. In addition to that, on May 2nd, the UN put out a report estimating that 79,000 structures in the Gaza Strip are completely destroyed, and that 350,000 are badly damaged, amounting to about 56%. According to, this is just an anecdote, according to the UN reports, it is estimated if the rate of clearing rubble is like the past escalations between the sides, that it's going to take until the year 2040 to clear all the rubble from the Gaza Strip. In addition to that, there's a lot of information about the tunnels that have been found. Again, don't have time to get into it, but feel free to ask me about that later. Regarding casualties, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip is reporting, these figures are as of this morning, that 34,735 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip and 78,108 Palestinians have been injured. The Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip, I know a lot of people have a lot of controversy about using those figures. A lot of people have a lot of controversy about not using those figures. I'm saying factually, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip, and I'm happy to take questions about that because that is a question I get a lot. Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip does not distinguish between fighters, armed operatives, and civilians. It counts bodies that arrive at hospitals. So if we take this figure of 34,000, with that, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, that does not report how many Palestinians it estimates have been killed in the Gaza Strip, has said that it estimates that some 12,000 to 13,000 militants have been killed in the Gaza Strip. And those numbers are likely outdated because that was published over a month ago. But the IDF has not put out any updated figures since. Again, we could talk about these figures specifically later. In turn, alongside the fighting in the Gaza Strip, the IDF has lost 267 soldiers during the fighting in the Gaza Strip, and 1,610 have been injured. That's what I'm saying about the fighting in the Gaza Strip. But again, because a lot of this is controversial, I presume that we'll talk about that later. In addition to this, it's also important to note there are some 1.8 million internally displaced Palestinians currently in the southern parts of Gaza, which is part of the complexity of the ongoing fighting that's going to happen in Rafah up and coming, depending on the results of the ongoing negotiations. Moving on to the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. So again, I bring just as a reminder some figures about the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip, like I said, a very dense place. Unemployment in the Gaza Strip is estimated prior to the war at 48%. Tells you something about the levels of poverty. It is run by Hamas. Hamas is a designated terror organization and, as we know, has spent a lot of its money on tunnels and weaponry. The life in the Gaza Strip, the expectancy, the GDP is very low. It is also under siege. And regarding humanitarian aid, prior to the war, upwards of 500 aid trucks entered the Gaza Strip each day. So again, meeting the minimum requirement of aid agencies, giving out food, medical supplies, shelters, water, etc. 500 trucks per day. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, I would argue, can roughly be divided into 3 phases of the war. In the first phase, from October 8th until November 24th, there was an absolute siege. Like I said, electricity was cut off, water lines were cut off. Israel only supplies about 20% of the water to the Gaza Strip, but those were cut off. No aid trucks were allowed in initially. Starting October 21st, as a result of international pressure, Israel began allowing 28 trucks to come in per day. But again, has to be taken within context that usually 500 trucks would come in per day, and now during the war, it was 20. So during the first time period is the absolute siege. Then there was a truce and a hostage exchange between the sides between November 24th and November 30th. And during that truce and part of the negotiations was a substantial increase in the humanitarian aid that was coming into the Gaza Strip. As a result of that, the number of aid trucks coming in rose to 100 to 200 a day, and there was a general ease in the siege. Water lines were repaired and things like that. Things started to get a little better before a massive deterioration that occurred in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip in February. That is when there started to be reports of children dying in hospital from malnutrition, of hunger, what now the UN defines as famine, in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. That deterioration is broadly a result of four things coming together in the way the war was being run. One was the breakdown of the IDF's coordination with UNRWA. UNRWA, the United Nations Work and Relief Agency, the main aid agency that is designated to work with Palestinians. Israel had exposed that 12 workers of UNRWA had participated in the October 7th attack. Israel said that more workers, but 12 are only the ones that proof has been given. And the coordination with UNRWA stopped existing. The IDF said we're stopping to work with UNRWA. So that's one of the main factors that contributed to this. As a result of the decrease in aid that was coming in as a result, Hamas started to also raid a lot of the aid trucks that were coming in. Also contributed to less aid getting to the population. A third factor is that leading up to the expected Rafah invasion, which has been expected for about 2 months, again, may have started today, but for 2 months it's been up and coming, the IDF started assassinating the heads of the police stations that were run by Hamas in Rafah and in the town of Deir al-Balah. That is very essential because according to international agreements, aid trucks can only come in if they have police escort. And police officers stopped showing up for work for fear of assassination. So there was a dramatic decrease from about 200 trucks per day to about 50 coming in per day. And then the fighting in Khan Yunis also made the situation a lot more complicated. The situation deteriorated greatly in February, and that was roughly the situation until March 31st. 2 incidents made the situation change dramatically. 2 tragic incidents. One, between February 28th and February 29th, between 120 and 130 Palestinians were killed when they were trying to storm aid trucks that were coming into the northern parts of the Gaza Strip to get to the aid. Very controversial. Some were shot by the IDF. Some arguments on the ground said that all were shot by the IDF. The IDF put out its own reports saying that it didn't happen. Whatever happened, the fact is 120 to 130 people died. This led to a lot of international pressure on Israel, led to the beginning of aid paradropping missions. Those planes that we've seen dropping aid from the sky. Then on April 1st, 7 workers of the World Central Kitchen, which is one of the biggest aid agency organizations in the Gaza Strip, were killed by an IDF drone. This also led to monumental international pressure on Israel and was a game changer. Since then, Israel has opened up several crossings into the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. The number of trucks coming in has risen exponentially, and Israel has started cooperating with a maritime corridor that the U.S. is constructing, the famous floating pier that is supposed to be start working any day now. All this happened since April 1st, and things have been changing. So the humanitarian situation really can be divided into those 3 different time periods. In addition to this, the medical establishments in the Gaza Strip have essentially collapsed. There were 36 hospitals in the Gaza Strip. A lot of these hospitals were used by Hamas. There were tunnels underneath them. The IDF carried out a lot of different raids into the different hospitals. Essentially, the medical system in the Gaza Strip has collapsed. This picture over here is what is left of the largest hospital in the Gaza Strip. Al-Shifa Hospital looks like that. Regarding figures and data from the last 7 months, these are figures from the IDF, and the IDF has to approve every aid truck that comes in. Therefore, they're the most accurate figures. Again, this is as of May 3rd. 27,330 aid trucks have entered the Gaza Strip. That amounts, in terms of average for the war, to roughly 130 trucks per day. Fuel tankers, cooking gas, paradropping missions, etc. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is a critical facet of the war. No matter how you slice it, or no matter from which side people are trying to look at it, the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip has been one of the only things that the United States has used to level a lot of pressure on Israel to change its tactics in the war, to not carry out different evacuations, to not do all kinds of things. So that's why I treat it as its own subject, not alongside the fighting, even though they are highly, highly interconnected. Departing from the Gaza Strip for a minute, another arena that is very, very critical to the war and the way it is developing is the West Bank. And if we remember the map, the other side of the occupied Palestinian territories. Like I said, the West Bank is insanely complicated to understand, even just the logistics of who controls what. The West Bank is under overarching IDF controls all of the entry points and exits. However, within the West Bank, as a result of the Oslo agreements and different agreements between the sides, 60% is controlled directly by the IDF under martial law, and there are Israeli settlements there. Then another 40% is divided. In some cases, it is under Palestinian Authority autonomy. In some cases, it is under mixed control of the IDF and the Palestinian Authority. Insanely complex. Because of that, I am going to note, it is also quite difficult to get accurate figures of what exactly is happening, and I'll give as an example. The United Nations, before I give the example, I'll continue my spiel. On October 7th, Hamas called upon all Palestinians to rise up. Hamas called upon all Muslims in the Middle East to rise up and liberate Palestine. There was an expectation that the West Bank is going to go up in flames. As a result, there have been also a lot of IDF crackdowns within the West Bank, and there's been an exponential rise in intercommunal violence, attacks by Palestinians, attacks by Israeli settlers. One of the reasons that I say it's hard to get accurate figures is because I spent well over an hour trying to find, okay, so how many attacks have been since October 7th in the West Bank? Very complicated. The United Nations has documented over 800 attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinians since October 7th. However, that includes attacks that occur in East Jerusalem. Again, my students in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict know that East Jerusalem is very complicated. Is it part of the West Bank or is it not? And those figures contradict other figures. In turn, the Israeli Shabak, that's the equivalent of the Israeli FBI, has documented between 350 and 500 Palestinian attacks per month in the West Bank against security forces and Israeli settlers. However, they include in that figure every time the IDF carries out a raid, if anyone throws a stone at the trucks. It's not just attacks that are carried out. It's also just attacks that are part of violence as a result of IDF raids. So, forgive me for not bringing all the figures. That's why I didn't put them on the slide, because I had too many asterisks of what each figure includes. Essentially, the key elements since October 7th, there's been this dramatic rise, no matter how you slice it, in violence. The IDF has carried out over 70 division-wide raids in the West Bank. That just means very big. Let's leave it at that. A total of 474 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, of which 457 were killed by the IDF, 10 were killed by settlers, and 7 killed unknown, either by settlers or by the IDF. Of them, the IDF says that roughly 450 out of the 474 were involved in terror operations. In addition to that, 11 Israelis have been killed in the West Bank as a result of Palestinian attacks, and 47 Israelis have been killed in Israel as a result of attacks that originated from the West Bank. Again, the main thing to take away from this is that this is another arena that, while it's not essentially part of the Israel-Hamas war, in fact it is. Because every time there's an escalation that goes on in the West Bank, it has a direct influence on the Gaza Strip from either side. When there's more Palestinian violence from the West Bank, that influences the IDF activity in the Gaza Strip. When there's more IDF activity in the West Bank, that influences Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So it's another arena that just has to be taken into consideration. And if we're talking about other arenas that are influencing the war, going now to more regional developments that have been happening in the war. Like I said, on October 7th, Hamas called upon all Islamic forces, all Palestinians and all Islamic forces, to join the fight to liberate Palestine. And Hamas genuinely expected Hezbollah, which is a militia in southern Lebanon, to join the war. On October 8th, Hezbollah does answer the call and starts firing rockets and missiles towards Israel. However, it becomes very, very apparent very quickly that Hezbollah is not actually throwing all of its force into the war. Hezbollah, I'll say as an anecdote, is a lot stronger than Hamas. Hezbollah has many more fighters than Hamas. Hezbollah has many more rockets and missiles than Hamas. It is wealthier than Hamas, etc. Hezbollah has been launching barrages of rockets and missiles almost every day. Yesterday, 100 rockets and missiles were fired. Nonetheless, while I don't belittle that, nonetheless, it is far from Hezbollah throwing all of its forces into the war, but it is enough to create another arena. One of the things that have happened, when the war began, Hezbollah started to fire these rockets and missiles. The IDF started retaliating. There's been massive internal displacement on both sides. Between 60,000 to 100,000 Israelis and between 60,000 to 100,000 Lebanese have evacuated. Lebanese to the north and Israelis down south as a result of this fighting. However, at the beginning of the war, this was just seen as a proxy of Hamas. Hezbollah was firing because it said it is supporting the Palestinian cause. And Hezbollah said, if Hamas accepts a ceasefire, so do we. And that is in fact what happened. In November, Hamas accepted a truce, and Hezbollah stopped firing that moment, even though they were not part of it. Since then, that has changed. Since then, in the last several months, there have been more and more escalations between Israel, the IDF, and Hezbollah. And as a result, both sides have openly said that their fighting arena now is its own segment. Hezbollah said, we'll still accept the ceasefire if Hamas does, but the IDF has said, yeah, but we're not accepting that because the IDF is not willing to have Israeli civilians go back north with Hezbollah on the border. So right now that fighting is still going on, and it's its own arena when it comes to diplomatic relations and attempts to resolve the situation, which I'll say something about that in a minute. It's its own arena with regards to the war, because it is very likely that if and when, a deal is signed between Israel and Hamas, and either for a truce or a ceasefire or an IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip or whatever ends up happening, what happens between Israel and Hezbollah is very likely going to flame that up again. Because, this has been said already by Hamas, well, Hezbollah came to our aid on October 7th, so clearly, if the war continues with them, then it's another problem down here. So it has to be taken into consideration. A resolution between Israel and Hamas, if such a thing were to happen, does not mean an end to the war when it comes to this arena. Some of the figures are up here: over 3,300 rockets, 240 heavy missiles, anti-tank missiles, drone attacks, IDF attacks, over 1,300 airstrikes, 3,200 ground bombings, very, very notable assassinations that the IDF has carried out in Lebanon. One of them, Salah al-Aruri, on January 2nd. This is number 2 or 3 in Hamas's external leadership, was assassinated in Lebanon. Wissam Tawil, on January 8th, the commander of Hezbollah's Radwan force. The Radwan force are the commando units of Hezbollah. So all that is going on. There's been a lot of casualties. Hezbollah has said that 290 of its operatives have been killed. There's also been dozens of people killed in Lebanon. In Israel, roughly 24 people have been killed as a result of bombings. Again, when compared to what's going on between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, it's not a lot. But taken in context that this could also inflame the situation again, it's just something that has to be considered. 1 second. Sorry. Other arenas, meanwhile, going on. Not going to get into each one of them because just don't have time. However, a lot of different militias within the Middle East, most of them tied inherently to Iran, some actually funded directly by Iran, some of them just loyal to, joined the war, answered Hamas's call, much more than Hezbollah, threw a lot of their forces into the war. The biggest are the Houthis. The Houthis, a militia that has taken over since 2014 large parts of Yemen, started to impose what they considered a maritime siege on, at first it was any ship that was associated with Israel crossing through the Red Sea. Then started imposing that also on US ships. Then the United States formed a coalition. Ongoing fighting is going on there. Another arena, though, that actually has one of the biggest influences on the world when it comes to international trade. Over 20% of the world's international commerce goes through the Red Sea each day, but all of a sudden ships are being taken over and attacked. In addition to that, there were also different militias in Iraq and Syria that started to answer the call. Mostly what they did is carried out attacks against US forces because the United States was supporting Israel. So between October and February, over 170 attacks, including rockets, drones, were launched at different US bases throughout the Middle East. One of these occurred on January 28th against a base called Tower 22 in Jordan, killing 3 US service people. As a result, Iran told its militias to stop. As a result, Iran all of a sudden got very scared that this is not just badgering the United States, but may actually cause the US to retaliate, and told the militias to stop. Since then, there's been no attacks. There's been now 2 in the last 2 weeks. But since that moment, there were no more attacks on these militias. They have been active, though, in different attacks against Israel. Meanwhile, in addition to all this, this war has brought about the first open attack between Iran and Israel, despite years and decades of threatening one another, and Iran funding Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all these militias. Iran has never carried out an actual attack against Israel until this war. I'm not going to get into the specifics because I'm just running out of time, but essentially, as a result of IDF attacks that occurred in Syria against Iranian forces, the forces of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, specifically on April 1st, a very high-ranking Iranian official was assassinated. Iran, on April 13th, launched its first attack against Israel. Over 350 drones, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles were fired from Iran towards Israel. They were intercepted, very, very interestingly, by Israel, the United States, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and rumored United Arab Emirates, and even more rumored Qatar. Rumored. Qatar never admitted that. Qatar has said that they did give the United States access to their radar systems to help in the interceptions. It is very interesting when it comes to the regional alliances and the regional developments. Again, something we could talk about later. Importantly, though, one of the things is this is another facet of the war. On April 19th, retaliation was carried out in Iran. Israel had not accepted responsibility for it until yesterday, when one of the ministers in the Israeli government accidentally in an interview said it. What can you do? Seemingly accidentally. However, fact is that Israel did retaliate in Isfahan, also against Iranian targets in Baghdad and Damascus. Again, its own arena that is very, very important when it comes to the war. Political developments and the future of the Gaza Strip. And with this, I'm going to make this very short and then open it up to questions. I know you're signaling me. I see your smile. There's been way too many political developments to talk about. Possibly one of the biggest one is the law case that South Africa brought against Israel in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, on charges of genocide. That is very important because the ICJ is debating that case, and on January 26th issued injunctions ordering Israel to change how it was operating when it regards to the humanitarian situation, and Israel has been trying to do that to large extents. So they are very important. There's also the facets of the regional deal. The United States is trying to develop a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia that will involve the establishment of a Palestinian state. It seems highly unlikely at this point, given the composition of both the Israeli government and Hamas and Palestinian Authority, but you never know. When it comes to the future of the Gaza Strip, what is going to be? No one really knows, and there aren't really plans. Israel has declared that Hamas is going to be destroyed, but there is no real plan for what's going to happen later on. Prime Minister Netanyahu has presented his own plan. The entire plan is a page and a quarter. It's not a full thought out plan about what's going to happen. Gadi Eisenkot, a member of the War Cabinet, has also developed his own plan. It was a total of 3 pages. So developing. In turn, Hamas has said that they're going to take over the Gaza Strip again and continue the fight against Israel. The Palestinian Authority exists in the West Bank. Has said that it is willing to accept responsibility for Gaza, but only if Israel pledges this is part of a Palestinian state that will be in the makings. And then there's also the regional actors, different Arab actors, and the United States and the EU. But again, mostly what I have to say about them is everyone has their own ideas. No one really knows. And therefore, we don't really know where the war is going in the sense that if it ends today, if this deal is accepted, that it leads to an ultimate ceasefire, or if it ends in 2 months, when Israel's taken over the Gaza Strip, that still doesn't tell us what exactly is going to happen with regards to that. There's a lot of different plans, which I'm happy to talk about. With that, I'm sorry that was a lot of information. And that was depressing, like I said. Keep it up.
So we'll start off with this question, which is a kind of a sort of obvious one, and a good one. Is Israel winning the war? When I read the news out of Israel, it seems as if they have not maintained control over areas previously controlled.
Good question. What does it constitute to win the war? What does it constitute to destroy a terror organization? One of the things I've been asked about since October 7th, since my field of study used to be more generally terrorism, is what is the history of terror groups being defeated? It is not good. There's probably one terror group out of roughly 3,500 in the last 50 years that has been defeated solely by force without any diplomatic resolution. So what would that mean? To win the war? Theoretically, the destruction of Hamas. How does that happen by force? Hard to say. But the question of, is Israel losing control in territories that it had control? Yes. But it's not actually losing control. Israel's relinquishing control. One of the things that Israel has done in the north of the Gaza Strip, in Gaza City, Rimal, Zaytun, Jabalia refugee camp, as well as in the south in Han Yunis, after it entered, it said it achieved operational control and really urban fighting, went house by house, building by building, clearing out massive amounts of weaponry, gauging gun battles, etc., etc. The IDF forces pulled out by order. Part of the thinking is that the IDF has said it is not going to maintain an active occupation in the Gaza Strip the same way it has in the West Bank. Thus, it's not losing control. There is a power vacuum that is being created. One of the things that has been a repeated critique within the Israeli government is that there is no plan. With the lack of plan, what has happened in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, once the IDF pulled out, Hamas came back in. Not Hamas fighting units, but Hamas police officers. Because Hamas is the government. It's been the government for the last 15, 20 years. It knows how to run. So all of a sudden, their police officers are back on the scene. All of a sudden, their municipalities are up and running. And that's why the IDF has had to go in again into the north. So right now, one of the problems is without a replacement for Hamas, the IDF does manage to get control and destroy the Hamas fighting units. But in turn, every time it pulls out, Hamas comes back.
So I have 4 Netanyahu questions, right? So I'm going to kind of smush them together. So what did Netanyahu know about October 7th and when did he know it? Like, does he carry responsibility for it? Number 2, do you think it would, there was one question which basically said he needs war in order not to go to prison. So doesn't that mean there'd be less war if he resigned, right? Those are good. So both the leading up, Netanyahu's culpability in leading up to the war, and the prospects for him kind of as the war goes forward. Those were 4 questions that were asked like that.
The question of culpability for October 7th is really a little different than what you said, because you said, when did he find out about October 7th? October 7th is a major strike against the almighty IDF, right? For the IDF that manages to carry out direct precision missile attacks in Isfahan in Iran, that knows which building Salah al-Aruri and Wissam Tawil are deep in Baalbek, lost control over massive amounts of Israeli towns and kibbutzim. So it's a massive strike against that. What Netanyahu knew and when he knew is already such a subject of conspiracy theory. Did he know that it was happening at that time? Did he deliberately wait until it responded? One theory says that part of the reason that he didn't come out to the media is because he was waiting for his makeup guy. I don't know. These are all conspiracy theories, maybe or maybe not. Where often people place blame on Netanyahu is more in the long-term policy. Netanyahu and his government. Netanyahu has been in power in Israel since 2009, with the exception of 1 year. And part of the stated agenda of his government was to not overthrow Hamas, to keep Hamas alive and weakened. One of the things that Netanyahu did in 2018, when the Palestinian Authority tried to suffocate Hamas monetarily, stop paying the salaries of Hamas officials, Netanyahu signed a deal with Qatar to allow Qatar to fund Hamas, just in order to not let it collapse, because, and again, here you can fill in the blanks. Here's already conspiracy theories of why. Most arguments would say because a weakened Hamas was good for him electorally. But again, that's most arguments. That's not factual. The factual is that the deals were signed. That's the famous suitcases of cash that Hamas was bringing in. So most people that assign blame to Netanyahu directly for October 7th put it on that, rather than on what happened on the day of October 7th specifically. Then, is it not good for him? Right now, Netanyahu is the weakest in the polls that he has been since 1999. And one of the things that he has repeatedly said is that he is aware that there have to be elections, but there's not going to be elections during a war. So a lot of people are suggesting that, okay, well, that's one of the reasons that maybe the war won't end. But again, that's conspiracy theories. What are the political considerations for this or that? I cannot say definitively what Netanyahu thinks. If I could, maybe I would be prime minister. I cannot say definitively what. No one wants me as prime minister, including me. I cannot say definitively what Netanyahu thinks. However, a good argument could state that right now he's looking terrible in the polls, and he has said there's not going to be elections until after the war. And a lot of protesters in Israel, hundreds of thousands of people are protesting, are saying, but isn't that one of the reasons that the war is going to drag on forever? So that's how I'll answer that.
Good. So here's one that's also groups together a few. What do you think explains Hezbollah's reluctant, hesitant participation, at least initially?
Good question. No one really expected that Hezbollah would not join. Mostly what has been published is that Hezbollah and Iran were quite angry that Hamas did not coordinate the attack with them. Hamas did not coordinate October 7th with anyone, including the external leadership. The external leadership of Hamas did not know what was happening until half an hour before it was happening. They were also caught by surprise. Among others, according to the interrogations that have been published of different Hamas operatives, the reason for that was that Hamas didn't want any intelligence to leak out, so they didn't want to let anyone know, including anyone in Hezbollah. But Hezbollah had been training to do the same type of thing for years. Hezbollah is the one that came up with the Radwan force that started building the tunnels back in the 80s. Hezbollah was the one that had prepared for this, and their element of surprise was lost, and they were very angry. In addition to that, however, unlike Hamas, Hezbollah has a lot of internal political considerations. Hezbollah is also a political party. It holds seats in the Israeli part. It holds seats in there's a lot of different actors going on. It holds seats in the Lebanese parliament. Thank you. It holds seats. It's not the worst mistake I've made when I've talked about this. It holds seats in the Lebanese parliaments. It has people in cabinet. Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, actually has to answer on for what it does. And one of the things that happened recently is Hezbollah's main opposition in Lebanon, Samir Jaja, stated that Hezbollah has dragged Lebanon into the war unjustly, that Lebanese people are dying because of that. He's doing this because he wants to get more votes. Hezbollah has other considerations in addition to carrying on this fight. That is the main reason that they are much more hesitant. They're not interested right now in Lebanon being destroyed for this.
we hear reports of Hamas. We hear contradictory reports, right? Of, on the one hand, everybody supports Hamas. And on the other hand, Hamas is becoming less and less popular in the Gaza Strip. So we had a good question here. How legitimate is Hamas as an authority within the Gaza Strip in terms of would Gazans still pick Hamas over, would they pick Hamas over anybody else?
There's no polls that are reliable in the last months. There were right when the war broke out. Hamas has become a lot less popular as a result of both the war and the devastation, but also simply as a result of life expectancy and the economic situation and situation in the Gaza Strip. It has become more popular in the West Bank because the West Bank situation is completely stagnating and the Palestinian Authority is cooperating with Israel on the one hand to keep the situation at a status quo, which is very not good for the Palestinians. So Hamas, while people in the West Bank may or may not support the specific acts of violence, is at least presenting some alternative. So it is becoming less popular in the area that it controlled in the Gaza Strip and more popular in the areas it hasn't controlled in the West Bank. In terms of the allegations that that all Palestinians support Hamas, all they voted for Hamas, the last elections that occurred in the Palestinian territories were in 2006, and Hamas won by a small majority. It is highly untrue that all Palestinians support anything, just like not all populations of anything support anything. Whoever's elected next president, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, not all Americans support this or that. So it's not true that all Palestinians support Hamas. Hamas, in addition to its fight against Israel, also presents a lot of different internal political alternatives to the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is, in fact, known to be a lot less corrupt when it comes to internal Palestinian politics than the Palestinian Authority. There's a lot of other reasons why Hamas also maintains popularity despite, not even because of, despite the devastation that it brings about to the people. I will say that one of the interesting facets that we've seen, Hamas ran a dictatorial regime in the Gaza Strip, and in the areas that the IDF evacuated, we have seen for the first time in Gaza's history social movements and protests that are coming out chastising Hamas. A movement called Gaza Liberators is holding rallies every day in Rafah and in Jabalia refugee camp, chants against Hamas for the devastation it's brought about. So there is steaming movement there, but how much it actually represents remains to be seen.
The Iran missile attack and the counterattack. There are a couple questions in here about that. There were reports that Iran actually didn't intend to cause any serious damage, despite the fact that it launched these hundreds of projectiles towards Israel, and that Israel's response also did not intend to cause any real damage, that this was all some kind of kabuki theater, which was pre-orchestrated, right? And I'll say, this is outside of the questions, I always found it sort of hard to believe that you would risk, when you send off hundreds of projectiles, some of them could hit something, right? And then when Israel responds, that something that it does could actually hit something. What's your take on this, or what is the kind of word within the press and journals that, and your friends that they read? What was this exactly? Was this simply a kind of a gesture, or was this a kind of a legitimate military exchange?
I mean, you presented both options very well. I would probably argue more that this was more of a gesture, that Iran sent 350 cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones. Absolutely, you run the risk. Iran, a lot can be said about the way that Iran runs its country. It is certainly not dumb. It is certainly not dumb, and if there's one thing that it knows how to do is operate warfare. And if Iran wanted to send that level of devastation towards Israel, they would not have launched these, first of all, from Iran, where it took 8 hours for the missiles to get there. I was literally doing interviews at different news sites saying, look, the missiles are on their way. I don't know what's going to happen. Like for hours, like the missiles are on their way. So the fact that Iran did that was, on the one hand, a monumental display of force And in that sense, I think that Iran wouldn't have minded if a few would have hit, in order to show, mostly to show, to save face versus its militias that it has activated around the Middle East to carry this out, when Iran, because on April 1st, the attack that the IDF carried out was in the Iranian consulate in Damascus. So as far as Iran was concerned, this was an attack on Iran. So, saving face, Iran is launching the response, but the response was really not meant to escalate towards a war. Iran's not interested. Again, they have their own internal economic, political problems. They're not interested. Similarly, Israel's retaliation was amazingly meant to send a message. It was not meant to do anything else. Israel's retaliation was meant to scare the Iranian regime. First, they attacked air defenses surrounding the nuclear facilities in Natanz, showing Iran, your air defenses cannot stop us, and we can get to the nuclear facilities if we want to. More importantly, according to at least what was reported on the ground, the attacks occurred from within Iran. The attacks occurred from likely Mossad agents that are planted within Iran, activating drones that carried out the attack. There was one attack that in the area of Tabriz, where the report said that a drone came from outside of Iran. Otherwise, they're all from within Iran. All of that was messages. All of that was meant to be messages sent to the Iranian regime saying, FYI, we can get to you. We can get to you at any point. And that is also the reason that Israel did not actually take responsibility for it at that time. It was a message. Iran got the message and that's it. So yes, I think that it's more messaging.
Another kind of geopolitical question. A large part, I'm reading here, a large part of international contention has been international financial and military support for Israel. Other than Iran, have there been any governments, regional or otherwise, that have been openly supportive of Hamas or more, let's say, highly critical of Israel?
So open support for Hamas, again, support can be diplomatic, and support can be financial or military. So financial and military, it has been Iran. Qatar is one of the main funders of Hamas, again, with Israel's agreement. One of the things that Qatar does amazingly well is they stay friends with everyone. Seriously, that's the way that Qatar, which is a small country without a strong military, manages. They allied themselves to some extent with ISIS while hosting the US fleet. Friends with everyone. Qatar also, in this case, helped Israel out in a lot of ways while the Hamas leadership is housed in Qatar, the external leadership. So Qatar also funds a lot of way. Syria used to be a big backer of Hamas until the Syrian civil war, when Hamas chose the wrong side as far as Syria was concerned and sided with the rebels. That is when the Syria kicked out all the Hamas leadership from Syria. So there have been different governments that supported Hamas over the years, but mostly, especially since Arab Spring, most of the Arab regional governments turned their back on Hamas because they got very scared of radical Islamic forces. So in Egypt, after there was the counter-revolution in 2013, Hamas became a persona non grata. It was actually declared illegal in Egypt. Same goes after there were protests in Jordan. Same goes with Saudi Arabia. So Hamas has had a lot of countries that used to support it more turn their backs. In turn, diplomatically, Hamas has been getting a lot more support since October 7th, public support. The two biggest countries in terms of both regional and international are Turkey. Turkish President Erdogan has fully embraced Hamas. In fact, there's open negotiations right now about Hamas moving its headquarters from Qatar to Turkey. Has fully embraced them, has fully said that October 7th is an act of national liberation, and et cetera, et cetera. And Russia. Russia has become much closer to Hamas due to its own internal political considerations. Russia is extremely angry at Israel for Israel not supporting Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war, and it's simply a result of that. And even when Israel condemned Russia for not condemning October 7th, Russia's response officially was a question to the Israeli ambassador in Russia saying, when have you condemned Ukraine for its violence? That's the equivalent. So Russia has become, and also in the struggle between Russia and the United States, right? The United States is the backer of Israel. Great. So Russia has no love for radical Islam. And has no love for Hamas. It's just out of these geopolitical considerations that diplomatically Russia has become one of the backers of Hamas.
So a hard question. Okay. Now, I'm going to state it even more strongly than on this card. The Wall Street Journal reported that the number of civilians killed in Gaza is the lowest in any urban war terrorist civilian ratio. So the issue of killing, and you brought it up briefly in your talk, right? That Israel said it killed 12,000 armed people, and which would leave the difference between 34,000 or 35,000 and the 12,000. I mean, why are we to trust the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry, right? Are these reliable numbers? You made a point of whenever you discussed, now I'm going to make it harder. Whenever you talked about Israel, you made a point of questioning everything except for, right, a few sources. You were really keen to kind of pinpoint, right, what is accurate and what is not when it came out of Israel. But you seemed less keen, if you will, to question the Palestinian Health Ministry's numbers.
It's all good to know that I seem keen. One of the reasons I'll say personally that I'm more keen, less keen on that than don't question as much these numbers is because that's the question that I get asked most about the numbers of them. So I'm used to it. I have my answer to that. I question numbers usually from all sides, and I try to corroborate, again, to the figures that I trust, usually as a result of seeing how sides relate to it. There's a few reasons why I do cite the numbers of the Palestinian Health Ministry, and I don't pretend that they're not a Hamas affiliate, and I do not believe them automatically, quote unquote, when they explain the cause of death or things like that. Because I've seen, for example, if people remember the Al-Ahli hospital bombing that occurred in October 27th, I believe, the Palestinian Health Ministry immediately said it was an Israeli bomb and that 500 people were killed. Later, they did not correct when it was definitively proven that it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad attack. They did, however, lower the numbers to 267 people that were killed. So that's one facet of the Palestinian Health Ministry, why I trust the numbers, because Palestinian Health Ministry simply documents bodies. It's gruesome, sorry. They simply document bodies. They have a lot of evidence. International organizations also have corroborated that these are the number of people who have died, not necessarily the reasoning, but the fact. In addition to that, I often say to people who question those numbers, and I think people should question numbers, but often people question those numbers and they believe more the numbers of Israel. Israel cites the same numbers when they do. And this relates to your question of looking at the ratio. On March 10th is the only time that Israel alluded to the amount of Palestinians that have been killed. Again, Palestinians, not just militants. When in an interview, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said that 13,000 Palestinian militants have been killed. I said 12,000 because the IDF says 12. He said in his interview 13. And he said at a ratio of 1 to 1 or 1 to 1.5 of every militant for every civilian. So if we take that and calculate that, which I did, that brings us up to between 26,000 Palestinians who have been killed to 31,500. When on that day, the Palestinian Health Ministry in the Gaza Strip had reported that 30,400 had been killed. So based upon that, I say, okay, yes, there may be some discrepancy, but the fact is that even when Israel is looking at the numbers, the discrepancy is not that high. So which is why I try to bring, on the one hand, the Palestinian Health Ministry's figures, on the other hand, and the IDF says of this, because actually I think that they are not disagreeing that much when it comes to what is happening. Now, in terms of the question, is this not an amazing, quote unquote, ratio when it comes to urban fighting? The comparison to different arenas of fighting, well, usually it's compared to Iraq or to Afghanistan. In that comparison, when it comes to international warfare, yes, this is actually one of the cases where you have a lower ratio of civilians that are being killed with regards to the comparison to militants. Arguments against that are, yes, but unlike in those cases, in this case, there are other factors that Israel is doing that could make the number even lower. For example, in those cases, there was no siege. People could flee, whereas Israel does not let Palestinians leave the Gaza Strip, or things like that. So I'm just explaining why there's international critique alongside. So in terms of like the sheer numbers, yes, it is something that, by comparison to other cases of armies fighting terrorism, the numbers are actually low. However, international critique also says, but Israel, given that it controls all the borders, and given that it controls the entire territory, very different than Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, could actually have been doing things a lot differently. So both those things are there.
So here's a question about the ICJ and the question of genocide. So how have the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, rebukes been effective in changing Israel's behavior? What about Hamas's behavior, the behavior of the other side? And just to add on to that, couldn't you actually say that for there to be a genocide, there has to be a stated intent, right? A stated intent or a good faith effort to kill off everybody. And that really what October 7th was an unsuccessful genocide. It was an attempted genocide, but it was an unsuccessful genocide. And that what Israel has done, right, what the ICJ has said is that this is a potential genocide, but it's not a genocide yet, right? So couldn't you turn around things in that way?
So a couple of things. First of all, what is the ICJ? The ICJ, International Court of Justice, is the official judicial arm of the United Nations. That's a critical facet because, first of all, now going purely from a legalistic standpoint, Hamas cannot be charged in the ICJ. Hamas is not a country. Legalistically, this is the reason that Hamas cannot be put on trial in the ICJ and Israel can. Hamas officials, leaders, can be put on trial in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And it is very likely that in the coming weeks, we are going to see the ICC issue international arrest warrants for Hamas leaders. In Israel, there's a lot of fear that they're also going to issue international arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant and the Israeli Chief of Staff, Herzl Levy. But in terms of equating both sides from a legalistic standpoint, Hamas, you'd have to recognize that they're a state in order to put them on trial for that. Now, in terms of expressing intent or not intent, one of the interesting facets about the case that South Africa brought against Israel, when you put a country on trial for genocide, you have to prove both things. You have to prove intent, and you have to prove actions. And also it's important to note that the legal definition of genocide is not only killing everyone. The legal definition of genocide, which is, again, what the court cares about, the legalistic standpoint, is also forcibly removing people to unlivable conditions, is one of the things. Is also if you specifically target children, is one of the things. Again, there's a lot of things that South Africa wanted to try to prove, but you have to prove intent, you have to prove actions. In most cases, historically, it's very easy to prove the actions. You see the dead people. But intent is a lot harder. In Israel's case, it's kind of the opposite. In Israel's case, many members of cabinet expressed genocidal views, said that there is no such thing as innocent Palestinians in Gaza, called to wipe out Gaza off the face of the earth, called to nuke Gaza, and these are members of cabinet, so they are decision makers. Intent was exceedingly easy for South Africa to substantiate, which is likely one of the reasons that the court accepted that it's going to review the case and did not throw it out. Proving and substantiating the actual evidence on the ground is going to take years, and it's going to be much harder. One of the injunctions that the court leveled against Israel was saying that it is not allowed to tamper with evidence, which is one of Israel's defenses for why it is not actually starting to clear rubble and do things like that, because it's not allowed to tamper with evidence. Again, it's part of the complexities and the lunacy of international law. But in that sense, the ICJ is following the letter of the law. Hamas cannot be put on trial, and Israel can be put on trial. Intent, Israel is saying, yeah, they said a lot of things, but they didn't do it. Doesn't matter. They're members of the cabinet. What's the difference between that and a genocidal dictator saying these things and doing them? You can prove intent very easily. The actual actions is going to court.
The answer. So based on your knowledge of Hamas, what do you think is the Hamas perspective right now about what happened and what will happen? Was this their kind of, it's hard to believe this was their dream scenario. So what do you think, I mean, because you've read a lot of their documents, more than you probably care to. What do you think is going through their, Sinwar's mind right now, or let's say a month ago?
So I get asked a lot, what did Hamas want? According to what has been published, with regards to the interrogation of Nukhba fighters, those are the Hamas commandos that were captured, which is different than what Hamas publicly said it wanted to accomplish. According to what the fighters on the ground said, first of all, they did not expect, forgive me for this language, October 7th to go nearly as well. October 7th to them was a shock. They fully expected, first of all, the IDF to be waiting for them. They said one of the reasons that they were very not strategic, they spread their forces amazingly thin across the border. I said 80 different holes in the fence instead of actually pouring into one concentrated fighting force, because they said we expected the IDF to know the plan, to be waiting for us, and we were going to try to see where is the weak spot and then pour forces towards there. The plan was also not to kidnap that many people, but every unit was told, if you manage to get through, kidnap. And all the units managed to get through, virtually all. The plan was also not to have the war drag on. The actual plan of October 7th, according to, again, what was published by the fighters that were caught, was to take over several Israeli towns, hold them for 5 days, and negotiate from that standpoint. That was the intent. They expected the IDF to be waiting for them. They expected Hezbollah to join the force. They expected this to go entirely differently, because that would be a very different point of strength. Instead of negotiating from the IDF attack, they'd be negotiating while holding Israeli towns and kibbutzim. So that is like what they expected. Now, one of the things that Hamas and in general sub-state actors are very good at is adjusting and changing what they're doing and how they're doing it. Right now, again, Hamas did not plan the ICJ, did not plan the international arena. It didn't know things were going to unfold this way, but right now, likely what Sinwar is thinking is, if I survive, and I say specifically if I survive, if he survives, he's a symbol. If he survives, and if the Hamas battalions manage to survive, then very likely they are going to take over the Gaza Strip again, and with a lot more international quote-unquote protection, because it's going to be a lot harder for Israel to launch another raid into the Gaza Strip later on. So I think that that's the most they're expecting right now to be their dream scenario at this point. Survive, and then be under, according to what was published right before I started talking, I was looking at what the current negotiations are saying. Hamas is demanding that the guarantors of a ceasefire will be Egypt, Qatar, the UN, and the United States. Think about that for a second. Hamas is demanding the United States guarantee the ceasefire, because they know that ultimately Israel can launch again into Gaza, but if the United States is the one that has to stop them legally, internationally, then all of a sudden they're protected. But that's not something they could have dreamed about as to negotiate on October 6th.
So this will be the last question, but I think it's one that's written here, and I think it's appropriate. This is your last question in public talk at UCI. What do you think is the best next step? Because you talked about Hamas just now. What do you think they're thinking? What do you think is the logical next best step for Israel? This gives you a chance.
My pitch for Prime Minister. There we go. At this point, Israel has the military capability of taking over the entire Gaza Strip. It could take over Rafah, and it could take over Deir al-Balah, which are really the last strongholds. Or it could withdraw from the Gaza Strip and say, not our problem, and try to fortify its defenses. Those are the two extremes. I would argue that from a comparative standpoint, if I look at the way terror organizations have been fought, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in Pakistan, Kashmir, the Caucasus, wherever they have been fought, terror organizations have, number one, almost never been defeated solely by a military, They have also rarely been given what, or an element of what they want and decided we've had enough. Rarely those two things happen. One of the only ways that terror organizations have been defeated is if a rival, a competing internal actor is propped up. Now, Israel tried to do that during the Oslo negotiations. My class, we're just getting to that this week. Israel tried to do that to large extents, and it failed. So something that a good friend of mine said, October 7th, one of the interesting things, it substantiates all sides. Those who are pro-Palestinian state say you have to create a Palestinian state, look what happened. Those who are against the Palestinians say you can't create a Palestinian state, look what happened. So October 7th, to a large extent, substantiates all sides. I would argue that at this point, Israel has very little options, if it wants to achieve some sort of long-term stability, to not have a different actor that it tries to groom within the Gaza Strip that it can work with. If it tries, comparatively historically, if it tries to just enforce repression in order to stop Hamas from coming back, that's going to last probably not more than 2 years before there's another challenger. So it is possible. Again, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very surprising sometimes, but I would say in the interest of more long-term stability, you have to have another actor that you're putting in place that's local. And then if you call that a Palestinian state, or if you call it autonomy, if you call it something else, those are political questions. But sheer repression is unlikely to succeed. How's that for a final answer?
So, I wanted to thank all of you, and I really want to say we made it. Again, thank Dean Maurer for sponsoring all of this and his fantastic staff of both the School of Social Sciences and the Center for Jewish Studies, and to thank all of you for turning out and the support. I know many of you personally, and you've heard the stories over and over and over again. And I just want to thank, and I think Alon does too, to thank all of you for your support this year, and continue to come out for our events. We have a few more, and stay tuned. Thank you.